we're at the stage now where there's sort of general agreement that something significant is going on. There's multiple candidate mechanisms. And by the way, COVID could be a culprit in this as well, right? I mean, we don't know because they haven't asked the questions. They have to really, it's looking like, based on Dr. Cole's work, who had all the pathology specimens, it really looks like the vaccine spike because they're not finding the nucleocapsid protein in with the spike protein in all these deposits in the ovaries and the adrenal glands, things like that. So it looks like something that is only delivering a spike, which is, of course, the vaccine. And so some of it may be benign. Maybe that liquid nanoparticle thing is a red herring. Maybe it doesn't really do anything, but it has to be ruled out. It has to be looked at carefully because something is up. And the fact that Pfizer was as concerned as they were is your smoking gun. So what comes next? What about the reproductive issues? Because of course that's where that's the horror story in all this.
That is the horror story. Well, Dr. Drew, I hate to do this, and Susan, I hate to do this, but it's not that Pfizer was worried about it. All of the documentation indicate that that was Pfizer's goal. And I hate to put it that way, but there's no other conclusion to reach. I mean, Pfizer has so much focus on analyzing the disruption of reproduction. And when they find that something is ruining human reproduction, they don't let the FDA know there's a problem here, you've got to stop right away. They double down. And I'll give you another example. The lipid nanoparticles, Moderna's website boasts that they traverse every cell in the human body. And that's why I personally didn't get vaccinated, because I have a neurological condition. And just, with my English major 8th grade biology knowledge of how the myelin sheath works, I couldn't figure out how, something that traversed every cell in the human body is not going to disrupt electrical impulses. But leaving that aside, these lipid nanoparticles have been known for 10 years to traverse every membrane in the human body. That's how they cross the blood-brain barrier. They were designed to take medicine to brain tumors. But of course, if you've got a brain tumor, you're pretty desperate, and a risk has a benefit.
It's worth it. Right. The risk is worth it. But this is, by the way, throughout the pandemic, what I've been complaining about was the risk-benefit diathesis has been ignored, whether it's from masking or schools or lockdowns or whatever. They just seem unable to do a risk-reward analysis. And I was commenting just today, I was realizing that it's been a year since the Super Bowl where everyone was mandated to wear a mask in an outdoor stadium. 1 year ago, with the level and activity of COVID really the same as it is right now. Think how insane how hysterical we were, that for the same level of COVID as we're experiencing at the present moment, we were having LA County authorities handing down mandates because we were in a panic, and here we are. Yeah, it seems to me that well, certainly it is the case that the FDA was willing to accept a lot. What do you think was, if we just, I don't want to assume we know the motivation unless they spell it out in any of those documents. Do they say we're trying to do X?
Well, it's more like the documents are like walking into a room where there are several bodies on the floor and they've been stabbed to death and they're bleeding. And there's murder weapons lying around, but you don't, and a big object has someone's name on it that is the source of the murder weapon, but you don't know why this all happened. So let me give you some examples.
Okay.
So the lipid nanoparticles traverse every membrane. That means they also traverse the placenta. So Pfizer knew that the lipid nanoparticles were traversing the placenta, and they knew that babies were being born early because the placentas of women were being made not intact. And in fact, Dr. Jim Thorpe, whom I'm sure you've had on or know about, maternal fetal medicine specialist, shows slides of a netting that you can see of calcifications around unvaccinated women's placentas caused by the lipid nanoparticles traversing the placenta. And in fact, the lipid nanoparticles go into the fetus, right? They go everywhere. So our own Amy Kelly, who's the project director, found in the Pfizer documents that Pfizer knew that the lipid nanoparticles were entering the membranes of fetal baby boys' testes, and not just degrading their testes in utero, right? And, little boys, when they're vaccinated, this happens to them as well, but also degrading the Leydig cells and the Sertoli cells, which are kind of the factories of masculinity, so that these little boys and even baby boys aren't going to grow up to, develop normally as adult men. And we don't even know what effect that's going to have on their ability to reproduce. But Pfizer kept going. Pfizer knew that, in this chart that shows all the menstrual dysregulation, there's so much spontaneous abortion and miscarriage. And in one section of the Pfizer documents, there were Pfizer told women not to get pregnant during the trials, which is interesting, right? It's a respiratory disease. What the heck? But some of them got pregnant nonetheless, 270. Of those, Pfizer lost 234 of the records, which I gather is illegal. You're supposed to follow the subjects to the end of the trial. But of the 36 women whom they followed to term, over 80% of them lost their babies. The babies died. And let me go on. Throughout the Pfizer documents, there's this really sick focus on reproduction. And it's like, it's almost like it's so focused that the goal of the injection has to do with reproduction. For example, in one section of the Pfizer documents, they're injecting male Wistar-Hann rats, and they don't inject the female Wistar-Hann rats. Then they mate them, and then they sacrifice the rats. And then they do an autopsy of the rat's reproductive organ tissue. I don't know why, but why are they looking at that? Pfizer tells vaccinated men not to have intercourse with women of childbearing age, and if they do, to use two reliable forms of contraception. Pfizer defines exposure to the vaccine as skin contact, inhalation, and sexual intercourse, especially at conception. So Pfizer knows there's something that vaccinated men's sperm does to a zygote or an embryo. And they're warning, vaccinated men not to have intercourse with women. They define exposure as having sex with a vaccinated man, basically. Pfizer knew that the lipid nanoparticles in the polyethylene glycol, this petroleum byproduct, which coats the lipid nanoparticles, it biodistributes. Well, it also biodistributes into breast milk if you're lactating. So Pfizer knew that 4 of the vaccinated women's breast milk turned blue-green, and that babies who were nursing from vaccinated moms were showing failure to thrive, agitation, sleeplessness, and convulsions in some cases. And one poor newborn baby in the Pfizer documents went into seizures from nursing from a vaccinated mother and died in the emergency room. So Pfizer knew all of this, and they kept going. They knew that the injection suppresses the sperm count and sperm motility of men. And, again, just going to kind of the disabling level of all of the metaphors. Susan will appreciate what I'm saying here, I think. All of the metaphors, all of the language we have about menstrual dysregulation in relation to this injection are inadequate, in my view, from having seen the Pfizer documents, because we've never been faced with anything like this. We've never been faced with a thing that happens to women that leads them to, at industrial scale of numbers, like hemorrhage, or past clots that they can't identify, right? And so what I'm saying is the numbers, and I just did a video on this, the tens of thousands of women in the Pfizer documents who are passing clots, hemorrhaging, bleeding twice a month, menopausal women, so many way postmenopausal women bleeding, 80-year-old women bleeding, 70-year-old women bleeding, 10-year-old girls having, menarche for the first time when they're getting injected, right? Women disabled from bleeding, right? We've never seen this before. So the CDC calls it, a change in your period. You might have, menstrual symptoms is maybe the most that they say. And yet what I'm seeing is women being really disabled at scale, because how how can you be a student or an athlete or a mom of small children or a worker or stand for 10 hours in a lab if you're a scientist or be a crossing guard or an agricultural worker, any of the things women do, if you're bleeding in such a disabling way. And that's right in the and women also describing agonizing cramps upon having intercourse with vaccinated husbands. So all of these things I think are much bigger than just, oh, your period lasts a day longer, which in itself is a huge change in women's lives.
The CDC states that COVID-19 vaccines are safe, effective, and reduce the risks of COVID-19. Always consult with your personal physician before making any decision about your health.